Most of my camping trips had been quiet in the best way possible. The kind of quiet where the air cools down after sunset, the fire burns low, and the only sounds left are wind moving through the trees and the slow crack of wood turning into ash. When you're out there long enough, that silence starts to feel normal, almost comforting, like the forest has settled in for the night. But sometimes, that same silence can make small things stand out more than they should. A single footstep on gravel, a zipper moving somewhere in the dark, the faint sound of someone walking. When you're camping, especially in places far away from towns, your mind starts trying to explain every little noise. Most of the time, there's a simple reason. Someone heading back to their tent, an animal passing through, nothing unusual. But every once in a while, something happens that doesn't fit neatly into those explanations. A moment that feels slightly off, not dramatic or loud, just strange enough that it stays with you long after the trip is over. The kind of memory that comes back later when you're lying in bed at home, remembering how dark the forest really was. Over the years, I've spent a lot of nights camping in places where the nearest town might be an hour away. Most of those nights were exactly what you'd hope for. A small fire, a quiet campsite, and nothing around except trees and darkness. But a few nights stand out for different reasons. Not because something obviously terrible happened, but because something about them never quite made sense. One of those nights involved a man slowly walking through a campground long after everyone should have been asleep. No flashlight, no conversation, just the sound of his footsteps moving from campsite to campsite in the dark. He stopped near my tent long enough that I started wondering if he knew I was awake. Another time I was camping alone deep in a national forest. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of something moving around my tent. Slow footsteps in the dirt, circling once, then again. Whoever it was never said a word. They just walked around the tent like they were deciding something. And the last one happened on a remote forest road where my friend and I thought we were completely alone, until headlights appeared between the trees sometime after midnight. A car slowly drove all the way down the road toward our campsite, stopped, and then just sat there with the engine running. At the time, each of these moments felt small and easy to ignore. Camping has a way of making strange things seem normal in the dark. But later, after the trips were over and I had time to think about them, the details started bothering me more than they should. The quiet footsteps between tents, the circles outside nylon, the car idling where nobody belonged. Most of the campground was already quiet by the time I crawled into my tent that night. It was a small Forest Service campground tucked a few miles off a 2-lane highway, the kind of place where maybe 8 or 9 campsites were scattered along a loop road under tall pines. When I arrived earlier that evening, only 3 other sites were occupied. And by midnight, every fire I could see had burned down to faint red coals. The forest felt still, the way it does when everyone has finally gone to sleep. I remember lying there, listening to the soft ticking sound of my cooling camp stove and the occasional rustle of wind moving through the trees. Eventually, even those sounds faded, and the campground settled into that deep, late-night quiet that always feels a little heavier in the woods. Sometime later, I woke up for no clear reason. At first, I thought maybe an animal had passed near the tent, but then I heard it again. Slow footsteps on the gravel road that ran between the campsites. They weren't hurried or careless, just steady steps, one after another, like someone casually walking through the campground. I unzipped the tent door just enough to look out. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of a man moving slowly along the road. What stood out immediately was that he didn't have a flashlight. Everyone camping there had been using one earlier, but he was just walking through the dark, like he knew the place perfectly. He passed the empty fire ring at the site next to mine and then slowed down. For a moment, I thought he might continue down the loop, but instead, he stopped, just a few steps from my tent. I could hear him standing there, not moving, not saying anything, just standing close enough that the sound of his breathing almost blended with the wind. I stayed completely still inside the tent, hoping he would assume I was asleep. After what felt like several long minutes, the footsteps started again, slow, unhurried, continuing down the road until the sound eventually faded into the trees. The next morning, I mentioned it to the couple camping across the loop and the older guy parked near the entrance. None of them had walked around that night. In fact, they all said they had gone to bed early. We were the only people in the campground, which means whoever was walking between the campsites sometime after midnight hadn't been staying there at all. And for some reason, that still bothers me more than if I had simply known who he was. Because he wasn't lost. He wasn't looking for someone. He had just been walking slowly through sleeping campsites in complete darkness, like he had a reason to be there, watching the quiet campground from somewhere between the tents and the dark trees, without anyone ever really knowing. That trip was supposed to be a quiet solo night in the forest. The trailhead was miles away, and the small clearing where I set up my tent sat between tall pines and a narrow stream. There were no marked campsites nearby, no other tents, and no lights anywhere once the sun went down. During the evening, everything felt calm. I cooked dinner on a small stove, listened to the water moving through the rocks, and eventually crawled into my tent sometime after 10. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I couldn't tell what had woken me. The forest was completely dark, completely quiet. Then I heard it, a soft step on dry dirt just outside the tent. At first, I assumed it was an animal. Deer and raccoons passed through areas like this all the time. But the sound came again, slower this time, and it was too deliberate to be something wandering randomly. The footsteps moved along the side of the tent, close enough that I could hear small grains of dirt shifting under each step. They stopped near my head. I held my breath without realizing it, staring at the thin fabric above me as if I might see a shadow through it. Whoever was outside didn't say anything. They just stood there. After a few seconds, the steps started again. They moved slowly around the tent, completing a full circle. Then they stopped again near the entrance. The zipper was less than 2 feet from where I was lying. I remember thinking that if the person touched it, I wouldn't have any warning at all. So I stayed perfectly still, hoping whoever it was might assume the tent was empty. The footsteps eventually began moving away, slowly, fading into the trees until the forest was quiet again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every small sound made me think the person had come back. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground around the campsite was mostly hard dirt, but near the stream, the soil was softer. That was where I noticed the footprints. A set of clear shoe prints circled the exact spot where my tent had been standing. They looped around it more than once before leading back toward the trees. I followed them for a short distance. Then the ground became rocky and the prints disappeared. There were no other campsites anywhere near that clearing, and no obvious trail passing through it. Someone had walked out of the forest during the night, circled my tent in silence, and then left the same way they came. I still don't know whether they were curious, lost, or trying to decide something about the person sleeping inside that tent, alone in the dark woods. While I lay there, pretending not to exist at all, until they finally walked away into the trees and left me wondering what they wanted from me. The third experience happened when I was camping with a friend in a remote Forest Service area a few years ago. It was one of those places you only find after driving down miles of narrow dirt roads, twisting through thick forest. We had followed a map earlier that day until the road eventually opened into a small clearing beside a dry creek bed. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat area where people had clearly camped before. What made the spot appealing was how far away it was from everything else. We hadn't passed another car for nearly 40 minutes while driving in. There were no houses, no cabins, no other campsites anywhere nearby. The road itself continued past our clearing for another 100 yards or so before ending at a turnaround surrounded by trees. That evening felt completely normal. We built a small fire, cooked some food, and sat around talking while the forest slowly darkened around us. By the time we put the fire out and headed into our tents, the sky above the clearing was filled with stars, and the road we had driven in on looked like a thin, pale line disappearing into black forest. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to my friend whispering my name from the other tent. At first, I thought something might be wrong with an animal nearby. But then, I noticed a faint glow moving through the trees. I unzipped my tent and looked out toward the road. Headlights were coming slowly down the dirt road toward our campsite. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The light bounced slightly with the uneven ground as the vehicle got closer. It wasn't moving fast either, just slowly rolling forward like the driver was carefully watching the road ahead. Eventually, the headlights shifted slightly as the car backed up. The vehicle slowly turned around in the small space near the end of the road, then began driving back the way it had come. Within a minute, the lights disappeared between the trees and the forest went completely dark again. We stayed awake for a long time after that, listening for the sound of the engine returning. It never did. But what still sticks with me is how deliberate it felt. Whoever was driving didn't seem lost. They had quietly approached our campsite in the middle of the night, stopped just long enough to look, and then left without a word. And when you're that far out in the woods, hours from the nearest town, encounters with strangers tend to feel a lot more unsettling than they would anywhere else.